So we took off again. Oh, and our second child, Alexandra, was born in New York. So the four of us went off to Berkeley. Okay, so at the end of my 3.5 years at Columbia, this was now the beginning of 1970, I decided I needed to go back to Thailand again because there were all kinds of things I wasn't sure about and needed much more information. So we did that, took the whole family this time, all four of us, and went back to Chiang Mai. And we ended up having the same ama and kind of house servant, which we had never had in our lives before, but we got used to that in the first field trip. And you really had to, in those days, have a servant to survive. Things were very different in Thailand then, of course. Chiang Mai was a smaller city with about 60,000 people and very few vehicles on the road. We knew most of the people who had cars. Very hard to get any kind of Western food. There was one store called Tantrapan on the main store where you could get things like Australian processed cheese and powdered milk. Yeah. Otherwise, we used buffalo milk, boiled buffalo milk for the kids. So this is the second field trip. I went back to Hue Tat and several other villages. The third field trip then was 77, on about 6 months. It was a rather shorter one.
Can I ask you also, in the dictionary, were you working all along in the dictionary? Or did you have the idea of producing a dictionary all along?
Good question. Yeah, right from the beginning, every new word I had, I put onto file slips. People nowadays don't know what a file slip is. And I did it with carbon paper, so I could do it in both directions, Lahu English and English Lahu. Susan would help me file them occasionally. You know, kept getting more and more lexical data, a lot of mistakes, of course. And each field trip I would correct and improve. The last two field trips, spent most of the time in Chiang Mai. I invited young folks from Hue Tat to come live with us or stay with us in Chiang Mai and work with them all day long. They had incredible staying power. They never went to the bathroom. They would sit there for like 8 hours just asking for. It went through every entry of the dictionary, correcting it, and giving me more examples and throwing things out, adding things. And that's when I met someone who was also going to play an important role in my Lahu work, a British anthropologist called Anthony Walker, who was just beginning a 4-year stint among non-Christians speaking Red Lahu, which was close to the Black Lahu dialect I was working on. And this was a revelation to me because these animist villages were totally different in atmosphere and in all possible ways from a Christian village. They were pretty filthy, red streaks of beetle everywhere, people just spit out, opium smoking, no sanitary facilities. Well, there weren't any in the Christian villages either. You went out to the woods, followed by an appreciative coterie of dogs and pigs. Anthony very generously let me go through all his field notes. This was in 77 already. This is the third field trip. He was finishing his report for the Thai Research Council about his 4 years' work on Lahu, and having trouble condensing things and with his phraseology and everything. So I helped him edit that report, and in return, or he would have done it anyway probably, he gave me access to all his field notes and let me copy all his texts, which had all this archaic religious vocabulary, which the Christians had totally forgotten by then, especially four-syllable elaborate expressions, which are very highly developed in the more elevated reaches of the language. So this was a great help to me, and all this new vocabulary made its way eventually into my Lahu dictionary. And it came out in '73. And a few years later, I tried to order more copies, and they told me they had remaindered it, or how do they put it? Out of printed it. And so I got very mad and said, "You can't do that. Why didn't you tell me? I could have bought up all the copies." And so they agreed to do a second printing. And this time I improved it. My student Julian Wheatley put in section numbers, which the original thing didn't have, and I had an addenda and corrigenda at the end and so forth. So the second version turned out to be better. It came out in '82. So then I launched into the main part of my career at Berkeley. There wasn't much going on in Southeast Asian linguistics then, so I started a few courses in it, which I ended up teaching for a long time. Plus, I did field methods every year with different languages, which was very useful. The Berkeley environment was, then as now, great, and it's a great place to be, to spend one's career. So perhaps I should say something about my background in Chinese, such as it is. As I said, I started off in this intensive language class with Y.O. Zhao's daughter, and great teaching assistants I had, using as a textbook Zhao's Mandarin Primer, which had his idiosyncratic system of transcription, Guoyu Luomazi, which was the first system I learned, and which I used for many years because it has the tones built in, so my system. Anyway, even though it's hard to learn at first. So I had that, and then when we went to Berkeley, it was Zhao Yuanren's last year teaching. So I took whatever I could from him. I took his course in Chinese grammar one semester, and then his course in Cantonese another semester. What we did in that class was we translated the Mandarin Primer into Cantonese. Again, he recorded us. No pressure at all. And I took, and then as Susan said, we took together this class by Edward Schaefer in Chinese texts, which was okay. I guess kind of liked it. And that was it. And then my Chinese lay dormant for a long, long time until the first trip to China in '83. The first Sino-Tibetan conference held in China was 82, yeah. And I couldn't attend that because our younger daughter was very ill at the time and had to miss it. I still remember a letter I got from you, David, who had been there, and said, "It's very interesting, you should be here." So. And next year, 83, I got to go to China. And there was no way I could lecture in Chinese then, so I prepared opening remarks in Chinese. I remember it was the spring, it was May, and on the way to the lecture hall, the ground was strewn with flowers. There was a high wind and blew. They looked like cherry blossoms on the ground, and that was kind of nice. I was wearing a hat to which I had affixed a red star in the front because I wanted to fit in. And they had assigned me an interpreter called Zhao Yansun, who was a very nice guy. His history went back to the Burma Road days, when he was an interpreter for General Stilwell's army in Burma. They flew over the hump into Yunnan. And he was very pro-American because he worked with, so they picked him to work with me. His English was okay, it was serviceable, much, much better than my Chinese. Anyway, he was my good friend, and we actually made this train trip together to Chongqing at the end of my time. That's when I took a boat trip down from Chongqing to Shanghai. That was an interesting trip, by the way. Met this weird guy on board the ship who, as soon as he saw me, started making anti-Semitic remarks. But really vulgar and vicious. And I tried yelling at him, that didn't work. I should have just ignored him. But it turns out we both got off the boat at Wuhan, which later turned out to be the place where our son-in-law ended up living, our future son-in-law. Anyway, he got off the boat at the same time, at the same place in Wuhan, and started following me around, taunting me every place. So I told Zhao Yunsun, and he told the authorities that this was a fascist, and they should keep him away from me. I had this horrible temptation one day. There was a sharp flight of stairs in the, what's it called, the Jinjiang Bingguan or something. And he was at the bottom of the flight, and I was at the top. And it would have been easy for me to just push him down the whole flight of stairs. But I didn't do it. Anyway.
But then you were invited back in '84.
Oh, yeah, invited back in '84. And this time I gave 10 lectures in Chinese with help of 5 grad students from Beida who went over each thing with me and gave me the necessary vocabulary. But it was hard work anyway, because they were every other day, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So
Hong Jun actually mentioned it to me the other day, that she had been doing that work with you. She's now one of the top professors at Peking University.
Really?
Hong Jun. She was mentioning how they had worked so hard trying to translate your lectures.
Yeah, things like wave theory and anyway, that was fun. I got to meet all the eminent Chinese linguists of the day who dealt with Southeast Asian languages, minority languages. But then I had to improve my Chinese, so there were several conferences after that where I had to give lectures in Chinese, so I eventually got used to the idea, even though it's still not one of my favorite things to do. In the 1980s, I got the idea that maybe we should try and pull together all the etymological information then available on languages of the Tibeto-Burman family, and apply to NSF and NEH for grants, and that's when the Sino-Tibetan Etymological Dictionary Thesaurus project started, which I guess '86, right? And every 2 or 3 years I had to apply for renewals, and the terms never quite corresponded. They were like, how to say, jogged? No.
Out of sync?
Out of sync, yeah. So I spent a lot of my time writing grant reports and doing renewal applications and so on and so on. But this turned out to be one of the great intellectual adventures of my life, I guess, because a bunch of very talented grad students got interested in the project, and we worked together for many years. The project finally ended officially in, I guess, 2013, 2014, but I managed to keep it going with extensions and things, and piggyback the Lahu text project onto it. And so it didn't really stop until 2016. John B. Lowe, everyone calls him JB, thought that we should print out all our etymologies, not just have it in electronic form. And so we did that. It came out last year, 2016. 2 large volumes. You've seen them there, right?
Huge.
Yeah, huge. Yeah,
They're like
very
atlases.
huge.
Right,
Yeah,
like an atlas, yeah.
yeah. And I still have no place either at the stud office or at home where I can spread them out. And I'm very afraid of tearing a page. I have to do it very carefully. Anyway, it's in print, and it's available for the low, low price of $400 if you want both volumes. I've managed to sell about 4 copies so far. So I'm glad there's some physical product there. The Library of Congress has a copy, and Berkeley Library has one, and the Linguistics Department Library has one. I should send a copy to China, I guess. Susan K showed me yesterday 2-volume set, 2 volumes thick like this with lexical data from
That's from the project he had with Ding Bang Xin and them?
I think so, yeah. So I don't know what that goes for, but I'd like to get a copy of that. I'd like to exchange. I'd be glad to send them.
And you've covered so many topics, in your work. So aside from tonogenesis, how did you get to this whole thing about tonogenesis? And there's so many. I just edited this set of books of seminal papers, and there's so many of Jim's that have really been seminal, and I couldn't put everything Jim. We should really do a separate just Jim volumes, but there were so many of them that have been seminal in the field, and aside from tonogenesis and what are some of the others? There was quite a few in a number of different areas.
Right. Well, now I remember how I got into that. Robbins Burling's very important book, Proto-Loto-Burmese, it got mentioned this morning in terms of the Maru, secondary final T and final K. He accounted for the tonal developments among 3 Loloish and 3 Burmish languages: Burmese, Zaiwa, Maru, Lahu, Lisu, and Akha. And Lahu has, at least Black Lahu, has 7 tones, and he accounted for 6 of them, but he didn't say anything about the high rising tone. And I remember we were in Michigan. We were at the Michigan LSA Summer Institute. That was 67, was it?
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember looking at these words which had the Lahu high rising tone. One was branch, which in Burmese is a kak with an aspirated K, and Lahu is ka with an unaspirated Q and the high rising tone. And other examples like this, like outer covering, which in Burmese is kauk, and Lahu is u. So again, an aspirate in Burmese and voiceless unaspirate in Lahu in the high rising tone. And then the idea came to me. If you looked at Burling's thing, Burling's monograph, when Burmese has an aspirate and Lahu has an unaspirate, that's when you can reconstruct pre-glottalized initial. And I noticed these words which have the high rising tone, all were in the Lahu, all were in a stopped tone in Burmese, in tone D if you want. And so then the idea came to me that, okay, you have a glottal element in the beginning of the syllable, and the final stop, which became a glottal element at the end of the syllable. So maybe it's a kind of dissimilation, like Grassman's law, and the high rising tone came in that very special environment. And that gave me the idea. And I wrote this paper came out in JAOS in 1970, Glottal Dissimilation and the Lahu high rising tone, and then the subtitle was A Tonogenetic Case Study. So actually, the word tonogenesis itself doesn't appear there, but the tonogenetic does in the title. But as far as I know, that's the first use of the term. And that's what got me interested in that. Then, of course, reading Audrey Cour and all that made me realize that this is an extremely important thing, and that not all languages in the family are tonal, and there must be a way where languages can become tonal if they weren't before, and ways in which they can lose tones if they had them, and that there was nothing set in stone about tonal systems. They can come and go like anything else. Another tonogenetic book I wrote, or monograph, is called The Lolo-ish Tonal Split Revisited, which was a revision of a previous thing called the Lolo-ish Tonal Split, in which I dealt with the problem of the fact that all the Lolo-ish languages I looked at the time, about a dozen of them, showed at least a two-way tonal contrast in stopped syllables, although Burmese, which is anciently attested, does not have a tonal distinction in syllables of that kind. So there must have been something which caused this presumably original single tone thing to split. After I worked on it for a while, I thought I figured out, I think, that the conditioning was different for obstruents and for fricatives and for nasals and resonants. The obstruents behaved one way, fricatives behaved one, the nasals and resonants behaved another way. And there's sort of interesting things. Out of the 12 or 14 dialects I looked at, 2 of them agreed in having agreeing in which set of words were in a high stop tone and which were in a low stop tone. But 2 of them had a reverse, a flip-flop, Lu Chuan and dialect of Nasu, studied by Gao Huaiyan. And really no explanation for this. People have tried to explain this, like Martin Mazodon had the idea that there isn't really any valid phenomenon called a tonal split. It's just a silly label. But how could you explain it? That if the high tone gradually lowered and the low tone gradually raised, they would meet at some point. You'd think to be a merger. So Martin's idea was there must have been a phonational difference in one of those tones. Maybe one was Berkeley and one wasn't, so they could pass each other in phonological space in terms of the pitch, but not in terms of what the phonation types would help keep them distinct. So some explanation like that is probably true.
Mm.